Because of COVID, a lot of events scheduled for last year were either canceled altogether or postponed. One of those that got postponed is currently at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And it's all about a Japanese art form where they take a piece of paper or maybe multiple sheets of paper and fold them together into works of art. Now, what they've done is they've made them out of steel. There's 18 sculptures right now in the Missouri Botanical Garden. And the interesting thing about them is when you view them, what is the angle of the light? And just the ability to walk around them entirely and see that sculpture from 360 degrees. To see how it has a different look, different feel, depending upon how you're viewing it and what the background might be for it. One of the major pieces is called Masterpiece, and it's piece, not a piece of paper, but the whole sense of piece. And it sits in front of the climatron. And so if you look at it, viewing the climatron, it has one look. If you look at it away from the climatron, has another whole look, and even from the sides. How do you view it? I think that's an important concept to have in terms of today's gospel. There's really three different scenes in today's gospel, and depending upon how you look at them, you get a different sense. The first piece is what's happening on the road to Capernaum. The 12 disciples are, as the gospel says, they're having an argument about who is the best of them. And like any argument, it can have a couple sides to it. And one side is, yeah, well, I'm better, I'm the best. You can almost hear Peter saying that. I'm the best. But the other side of that might be something like what John would say, oh no, you're the best. You're the greatest. And so what's the sense out of that? The sense of the word, I think we can walk away from for that first scene is humility. Humility. Understanding my place. Understanding where I fit in to the larger picture. And that is certainly one of the tensions amongst the 12 throughout the Gospels. Sort of, where do I fit in? And as they work their way through we work our way through the Gospels, we see how they come to that sense, this is my right place. This is where I belong. That is practicing that humility. The second scene in today's gospel is where Jesus is aware of the argument, and he sits them down and begins to talk about the one who is the greatest is the one who serves. The one who is the greatest is the one who serves. To really understand what he's saying, we need to go to the first reading and to the second reading. In the letter from James, the first part tells us what a servant's heart is. What a servant heart is. It's one that brings about peace. It's one that brings about calm. It's one that is gentle. That's the servant's heart that we are all called to have. That servant's heart. In the first reading, we hear about the ultimate servant. Wisdom is telling us about this figure who is to come. And if we are familiar with Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah there's a number of verses that are referred to as the suffering servant, the one who is unjustly condemned, the one who is unjustly condemned. And that's what wisdom is telling us, how the evil ones are looking, how can we capture the just one? How can we capture this one who is the servant of the Lord? And we hear Jesus picking up on that in the first part of today's gospel. In Mark's gospel, we've made a transition 2 weeks ago. We made a transition from people coming to an understanding of who Jesus is, or who they think Jesus is. And now Jesus telling the 12 and telling the others who he really is. He's on his way up to Jerusalem, the suffering servant, the one who will lay down his life for all. Not for some, but for all. The one who will freely give himself, that suffering servant. Reminder to us of how we are called to be servants. When I was in the vocation office for the diocese, we were working with one of the major ad companies in St. Louis, and we're trying to come up with a tagline for what was going to be what's our tagline for who the St. Louis priest is. And we came up with the tagline, as one who serves. As one who serves. And Frank, this is an apology to the deacons. Might remember a couple of years ago, after the ordination class of a deacon, they turned the phrase around. I came to be served, not to serve. We are called to be servants. And not just priests, but all of us are called to have that servant's heart that we hear about in that letter to James. The third scene in the gospel is Jesus brings this child into its midst and says, unless you become like a child. Now, we need to understand the first century Mediterranean mind in terms of children. If there was a fire in the house, the husband had the responsibility of getting his parents out of the house, then his wife, and then any children. Children are at the low end. What's our mindset? Get the kids first. The mindset of Jesus' time was a child, until they became of maturity, was almost a non-person. And so Jesus is saying, unless you become like this child, this one who is so often forgotten, unless you become like this child, the kingdom of God is not there for you. What are children like? They're innocent. They're like sponges. They take in all sorts of things. They're constantly experiencing life and trying to figure it out. And that's what we're all called to be like. Those sponges that are taking life in. And as we take that life in that, see the movement of God in our lives. See God's presence in our lives. We're called to have hospitality for God. So the 3 words for today's homily: humility, servant, and hospitality. Especially being that childlike person, opening ourselves up to the goodness, the mercy, the presence of God in our lives.